This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning. Welcome to today's meeting of the Health Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on the social media and use hashtag Assembly Health for this meeting. Please may I remind the participant to silence your devices. The main item on the agenda today is the health impacts of gambling in London. However, we have a few short items of business first. So can I ask the clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting, please?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received today.
Thank you. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask Assembly members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on today's agenda? No. Okay. Thank you. Yes, I think we can all claim to do that sometimes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of September 2023? Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. Can we note the response from the Department of Health and Social Care to the committee's letter regarding London Ambulance Services funding? Thank you. And that brings me to today's main item. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our members of the first panel joining us to discuss the health impacts of gambling in London. Rather than me going around to introduce the panel members, I'm going to ask the panel members to introduce themselves to the committee. So I'll start with you, Marguerite, Regan. I think you're the head of gambling and Office of Health Improvement. So from you.
Thanks. Yeah, as you said, I'm the head of gambling at the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, which is an office that sits within the Department of Health and Social Care. I previously led on gambling work at Public Health England. I've been working on gambling and I work across alcohol and gambling. I've been working in this role since we first built a gambling programme in 2017, first in Public Health England, and then it moved into the Department of Health.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sian Griffiths. I'm a retired public health specialist. I was once the president of the Faculty of Public Health, and currently I'm on the board of Public Health Wales. That's how I keep a bit in touch with public health, and I'm also the deputy chair of GambleAware.
Thank you.
My name's Tom Coffey. I'm a GP. I'm the Mayor's Health Advisor.
Thank you.
Good morning, Vicky, Hobart, GLA Group Director of Public Health and Deputy Statutory Health Advisor.
Thank you.
Alice Walker, Consultant in Public Health for the Public Health Unit in the GLA.
Hi there, I'm Will Maimaris. I'm Director of Public Health in Haringey Council, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the Association of Directors of Public Health for London.
Thank you.
Harj, a consultant for Red Card Gambling Support. I myself am someone that has gone through addiction myself, through £250,000, have tried to commit suicide, and on the other side. So we're now in a position where we're trying to do early intervention preventions for young gamblers, and this year we're really focusing on, and next year, around diverse and ethnic-based communities.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for all of you coming this morning and contributing to our evidence gathering. We have a big panel, and you're the first panel of two, so it's very important that we get very precise answers, and so that we can make progress. And because the committee is committed to finishing by 1 o'clock at the latest. Okay, so I'd be very grateful if something has already been covered by some other guest. Then please don't. Then just be on the watch out not to repeat yourself. But if you have something important to add and you think it's a point being made, then please do feel free to contribute. I'm going to direct my question first to Sian and to Marguerite. Is what are the health impacts of harmful gambling, and how widespread is the problem in London? So let's start from you, Marguerite.
Yeah, so I guess it's probably more useful to move away from kind of the narrative around the people at the severe end, which is what often people end up talking about very quickly. I think it's important to look at the population who are gambling. So in London, there's slightly below average, national average participation in gambling, but about 50% of the population are gambling. So that's the population you have to start with. And then when you look at actually the populations who are experiencing harm, we actually don't have massively great statistics on this, but we do know, so there's statistics that are actually going to be coming out in the next few weeks that are looking at the number of adults in London who would benefit from some sort of support and or treatment. And on that per 100,000, London has the highest rate. So even though you have low average participation, you have higher average of people who are requiring support and treatment. And what you see when you look at that group is that, so we're talking in 260,000 adults I'm talking about there. And I'm used to keep saying adults because we're not talking about children, and we're not talking about affected others here, which is another population that, again, we don't have a very good statistics on, but some statistics out there suggest that maybe 7% of the population, now that's GB, not London, but you can consider it comparatively, are negatively affected by the gambling of others. And then when you look at children and young people, the latest statistics we have say about a quarter of 11 to 16-year-olds are gambling on regulated forms of gambling, and of those, we have about 3% who are experiencing some kind of negative impacts, harmful, or participating in harmful gambling. And so, in terms of the harms, when you're looking at this group and who they are and how they're experiencing harms, it's those who are participating in online gambling, those who are participating in gambling products that are fast-moving, those who are gambling on multiple products at the same time, those who are gambling, it's the characteristics of the games that are being played in. There's much less. It's much less about the lottery and much more about kind of online slots, sports betting. Those areas are far more likely to be associated with those experiencing harm, and things that you see around those people are, if you have a personal experience of having an issue with gambling or a family history, then you're actually slightly more at risk. If you have peers who gamble as a young person, you are more at risk. And those from lower socioeconomic groups, they are, again, less likely to be gambling, but are more likely to be experiencing gambling-related harms. In terms of the harms that are being experienced, they're quite widespread. Obviously, financial harms are the ones that come to mind immediately, and debt and bankruptcy. We also know there's links with homelessness. There's a really, really interesting study done on banking data that looked at 7 years of banking data, and they showed kind of associations between gambling and negative impacts on finances. And one of the findings there was 10% increase in spending saw a 50% increase in needing a payday loan, and a 97% increase in missing your mortgage payment. So there is clear evidence there of financial harms, but the health harms are actually kind of very underrepresented. And as one of the other panel members said, there is actually clear evidence of a link with suicidality, at least twice as likely for people who are experiencing gambling-related harms, who are participating in harmful gambling to be at risk of suicidality. Really negative impacts on mental health, very strong links with depression. It's a very complicated relationship with other addictive behaviours, alcohol use, drug use. And then in terms of other harms, it's widespread. It can have a very negative impact on people's employment. The debt itself can sometimes then lead to, unfortunately, to people engaging in crime. So it's the gambling-related debt that's the crucial thing to harm here, that do lead to other harms. That can also have a really negative impact on relationships and on families. I could go on, but I'll pass over to Sian.
Thanks. Well, I'm not going to re-quote, but I agree with the things that Marguerite has said. I think these are well recognised. I just want to emphasise a few points. The first is definition is quite difficult, and I think that is an issue. So what do we mean by gambling? For example, lottery is exempt from the white paper that's coming up at the current time. So I think some of us would think that was gambling. I think that the assessment of harm is difficult because of stigma. People don't come forward. And I think that it is something about looking at gambling, not the gambler, because I think it is the context within which people are living. It's a very prevalent activity. How do we reduce the harm of the activity, I think, is a focus I would recommend. It's also a very changing field with so much having gone online and globalised. And I really flag that up as a risk for the future. And something that needs to be considered. One thing I think that I would emphasise is the affected others, the harm on affected others, particularly children, who are, if someone has a gambling problem, it's the impact on those around them as well, not just on the impact on them and their lives. So, and also that whole issue of comorbidity, particularly with mental health and other addictions. So I think there's a sort of very complicated field out there, and I think we'll go on today to talk a bit more about how you change the environment in which people are living to reduce the enticement to gamble, because I think that is the key thing that needs to happen, the primary prevention, rather than focusing downstream, as Marguerite said. And we tend to go down to the downstream, you know, those who have got severe problems. We need to think very much upstream, or else this can be a growing problem. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. I think this is, we're setting up the landscape of our discussion as we go along. My next question is to directed to Will and Tom. Are we seeing an increase or decrease in the number of people in London suffering from gambling-related health harms in the recent years? And what's behind this change?
Hi there. Yeah, I'm not sure about the data on the trends. I might need to defer to colleagues for that. But we do know, I'm just thinking from my own perspective and the communities that we serve in Haringey, that this is part of a wider context with cost of living crisis, life expectancy going down. Life is tougher in our poorer communities in Haringey. So we did some focus groups, and I think this adds some colour to the initial question. So focus groups actually asking our residents about the impact on gambling. And some of the things that came out were around that wider impact on the family. So we're in really challenging communities like Northumberland Park, one of the poorest wards in London. And if you put gambling into that mix, the children in that household, they're not able to have clothes if there's additional sort of gambling, problem gambling in the household, relationship breakdown and violence in the home. So while others can comment on the trends and the data, what we're seeing is really significant impact, and that's come out through our qualitative research locally. There's also real frustration, I think, psychologically, of the impact of particularly sort of land-based gambling in those kind of locations. So the frustration that people feel that nothing can be done about it, the frustration they feel with the local authority who do not have the powers to reduce that exposure to gambling, and also real frustration, we haven't really talked about children gambling, that children are being exposed to advertising, they are being exposed through games on their mobile phones to the precursors to gambling as well, and we don't have data and information on that, we don't have enough data. But on the first part, I will defer to other colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll speak both as a GP and as my work at City Hall. As a GP, yes, I am seeing more problems related to gambling. I have to say, more often it will be the family affected by the gambling who come to see me. You know, very rarely will I get a person coming to see me, you know, talking directly about, I'm a gambling addict, I need some support, I need some help. It's often, you know, family members who are facing the fallout from the impact of gambling on that person's mental health, on that person's financial situation, on that person's housing situation. So yes, within general practice, we're seeing more. What we also know is when people are people who gamble already, who are having financial difficulties, as we are in the cost of living crisis, they're more likely to go to increase their gambling as a way of addressing their financial hardship, which we know is utterly counterproductive. One study I saw last year in Manchester, looking at the police call-outs for people considering suicide, and they're now seeing one person a week in Manchester that police have been called out as a suicide attempt linked to gambling. Also, when I look at some of the data regarding betting shops and the London plan and the work of London councils to try to address that is quite significant. And it's something like there's 10 times more betting shops in poorer areas than there are in wealthier areas. So we know, in fact, that proliferation of betting shops, you know, is there to work towards those people who can least afford to gamble. But the data has shown by Marguerite that although you're less likely to gamble if you're poor, if you are gambling and you're poor, you're more likely to have some harm from gambling.
And do we have any measure of the incidence of this in London compared to the rest of the country?
I can address that if you want. So, I mean, there is no longitudinal studies around gambling in the UK presently. So we rely on, there's two kind of significant studies. There's the Health Survey for England, which you can break down to London, you can break down to a regional level. And if you look at trends across the years, if you compare the years across, you know, we've seen the rate of people experiencing problem gambling, so that at the severe end, that's remained relatively stable. But actually, if you dig into that a little bit further and look at those who are experiencing elevated risk of harm, so those that wider group, that is seeing an increase. So we have that information available. We don't have as good statistics that we would want. There is a need for more, data to be gathered. That's not a reason for a lack of action. Please don't let that be taken as what I'm saying. But we could always be growing more. This is an area that is developing. Gambling has only really been recognised as a public health issue and started being considered in that way and looked at with kind of a public health lens and a health lens in the last, I would say, properly decade. So it's kind of trailing behind what we know in terms of other public health issues, and which is quite frustrating for a lot of people. But we do have some data. There's more that can be gathered, but that's what we can kind of see on that trend. When you dig into it, though, there are different populations and different groups that are more at risk. The demographics in London mean that there are, we know that young males, for instance, are a group that are more likely to more likely to experience participating in harmful gambling. We know that some migrant populations are more likely to experience gambling-related harms. There are different subgroups, so the demographics in London mean that actually that's the reason that we're seeing that lower participation at the higher risk of harm, and we have some information around that, but not as much as possibly would be satisfying.
Thank you. And over to you, Harj. How does the prevalence of gambling and of gambling-related health harms differ across London's diverse communities? Do you have any feel for that?
Yes, I think I have to go back to what Sian is saying. Yeah. It's rather than the act of gambling, it's the gambler. So obviously we have to look at the cost of living crisis. We have to look at also what's happening with employment rates. It's obviously gone down over the number of years. So we have to look at what's the reasoning behind the person doing that in the first place, and most of it comes down to the lack of money and funds in the household. So when we looked at deprived areas, we're finding that people have a short amount of income. So what's happening now with the messages that are being pushed forward by the betting operators, it's a way of means to actually make money. So what we are seeing, if I just look at some of the characteristics, 70% of gamblers are identified as males. Now, if we look at those of ethnicity, 88% are white ethnic, but then 6% are from British Asians, and then 3% are from Black British. But the link going all from there is that people from the Asian and Black communities are 44% more likely to gamble and experience gambling harms. And the problem going forward with that is when they're going into this whirlwind or this downward spiral, it's how do they go and get help? Now we know that there's stigma taboos. Growing up, they've always been told, especially as men, to brush your emotion under the carpet. So going out and receiving help is actually an act of being weak. So I think the problem here is that many people from the ethnic minority backgrounds are not getting the help, is because, one, they don't understand what help is available to them, because the amount of advertisement or the messaging is not being pushed not nearly enough as the messages that are being pushed by the betting operators.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're going to move to other sections, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Assembly Member Best, and to pick up the next section. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we move on to the next bit, I just wondered, either Tom or Vicky, if you could maybe in more detail perhaps take us through some of the work the Mayor's done, obviously, from the 2018 Health and Equality Strategy. There was an impetus to work with partners and stakeholders. So could you just detail all that work and what has been undertaken to date?
If I start, and then Vicky can probably kind of join in afterwards. So I think there's definitely been a growing impetus behind the concerns expressed about gambling harm. So the approach, I suppose, that we have taken, and the Mayor's taken, is a public health approach to gambling: primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. On the primary prevention, it's the idea is what can we do to reduce children and young people going into and becoming exposed to problem gambling. And therefore the New Deal for Young People is a piece of work. Hopefully we're going to have about 100,000 mentors growing up until 2024 to work with young people to give them resilience, improve mental well-being and social cohesion. Because we know those are the things which prevent you going in to become problem gamblers. Secondly, we've done some work.
I didn't catch the phrase. What programme was that, sorry?
It's the New Deal for Young People, right, which the Mayor's funded. And that's the idea of the primary prevention.
New Deal for Young People, and so I'm guessing that's a wider programme than 100,000 mentors for...
Yeah, it is. And the idea is that when we've looked at the evidence of what child might likely to become a problem gambler, the other area is, in the public health approach, is very much about data and evidence. And I think it's really important that we build the data and evidence. So one piece of work we have done is commissioned the University of Sheffield to do a piece of work looking at the evidence behind the harm, what is the gambling harms, how do we measure gambling harm, what is the impact of advertising on gambling. And the evidence obviously came out from the University of Sheffield study showing all the effects that Marguerite described earlier on finance, mental health and housing, and also it identified those types of gambling which are more likely to produce problems thereafter. It was seen that for national lottery users, there's only 1% of national lottery regular users become a problem gambler, whilst it's 5% for slot machines and it's like 46% for electronic gambling machines and online casinos. So we know there's different types of gambling which can actually produce more harm. That came from the Sheffield study we commissioned. Also, what it did show was that
just to say on that specifically, that's going to be the whole next section.
Okay,
sorry. Just an overview.
Okay, yeah. So the University of Sheffield work we did, but that did look at evidence which we found was based in Canada, US, New Zealand, and Australia. So that didn't really pertain to the UK as much as we wanted to, and also it didn't look enough at the stationary advertising which the TfL network is linked to. So therefore, although I'm very keen on having an evidence-based approach, it highlighted the problems of gambling, but it showed gaps in our studies. The two big gaps we found are, one, a definition of what is harmful gambling categories, because if we're going to do anything in this field, we need to know, how we define that, and there is yet to have a national consensus on that. And secondly, we need to build more evidence about the impact of what we do in that field. And thirdly, we have met, obviously, Sian Griffiths recently and GambleAware to try to build up our partnership working and how we do this. The last bit I'll mention is a London plan, which London plan has identified an area of kind of betting shops being proliferated within town centres, recognising that is something which can have a harm to its community, so we've placed that in the London plan. That is a few examples of some of the work we've done. Sorry, over to you, Vicky.
Thank you, Tom. So fleshing that out again in terms of the strategy and maybe a little bit of the history to this, we had the Health and Care Devolution Agreement in 2017 in London, between London, the health and care ecosystem, so partners and central government, and gambling was signalled as a London concern then, particularly around fixed odds betting terminals. And, I think committee are aware of some of the national consultation work, so we're a few years on from that now, but this has been an area that's been signalled in London as a concern for quite a while. We have, within the strategy, in the healthy living aim, within the Health and Equality Strategy for London, Objective 5.3, which is ensuring that steps are taken to reduce the use of and harms caused by tobacco, illegal drugs, alcohol and gambling. And I think, as my colleague has highlighted, keen to draw out lessons and learning from approaches to other harmful products, particularly around the role of industry within that and some of the levers that we have to take that primary prevention approach. And then the last thing I would say is how we work with borough colleagues around this agenda, given where the levers sit to take action on this issue, and they are distributed across national, regional and local government. And this is an area of really considerable concern to local authority colleagues. I know that from when I was working locally, interestingly in Haringey many years ago, around that local sort of momentum. So the kind of convening and bringing together, there is quite a lot of work across the boroughs that we'll maybe talk to later, to get to convene around the issue, but also to support local areas in the action that they're seeking to take.
Thank you. So if I could, so the main things I got from those two bits were there's the New Deal for young people, The University of Sheffield Commission study, which we're going to go into in the next section, a meeting with Sian and the London Plan, the betting shop. So just to go into those other ones quickly, the New Deal for Young People, how is that going to be built with the connection to gambling? Is it, and how many of those 100,000 mentors will perhaps have a specific kind of knowledge of gambling?
So I think what we're trying to do in the primary prevention field for gambling is to identify what are the universal approaches we can take, which we know will make a young person less likely to become a problem gambler. So it's not an idea of whereby these are gambling mentors. They're not. They're people who recognise that the issues with young people which make them more likely to become problem gamblers are impulsivity, substance use, and poor mental health. And often if you can try to address those three characteristics by this mentoring program, you are going to make that child much less likely to become a problem gambler, because you're building resilience, good mental health, and social cohesion. So the approach in that universal way is the primary prevention. If you're talking about a more targeted approach, where you're saying, okay, then how do we kind of target our work at people who are, kind of more specifically at risk? And so I would echo the work in Haringey, who I think have commissioned something called GambleAware as a counselling service, whereby there they have identified and commissioned a specific targeted service for people who are already exhibiting issues with gambling, and that's secondary prevention. So the New Deal for Young People is a universal process, as all primary prevention is, and it's identifying the characteristics which make young people more likely to become problem gamblers.
Thanks. Was there, because I just asked as well if there was any mentors currently, because this was trying to look kind of more previously as what's happened
so
today.
There are already, so the target for next year is 100,000. I don't have the exact number we've got at the moment, unless any colleagues might know, but it's not 100,000 as yet, but it's, a significant number, and I can find that figure for you and let you know later on.
It's 100,000 young people, not 100,000 mentors, or 100,000 mentors. Right, okay, sorry. The first time I heard it, I heard of 100,000 mentors. Okay, right. Okay, and I think the bit with working with Sian, perhaps that will be drawn out later, because I don't want to step into future plans. Moving on to that, more on the work on the advertising bans. Sian, how could restricting advertising and marketing of gambling products reduce harm to public health?
Well, I haven't got lots of data to hand right now, but I would say that it's obvious that the more you're exposed to messages, the more likely you are to pick them up, and that's particularly true of children, and that's why there has been an agreement to not advertise during a football match, just round a football match, and there has been some work that Marguerite might be able to talk about the impact of even the continuing impact of gambling messages being available to children. So and you have to draw on the research. We're short of research in this whole field. We don't have, as Marguerite said, we don't have the longitudinal studies, we don't have the in-depth studies. And I think that the Gambling White Paper is hoping to refocus on gambling research and establish research programs in line with the others that the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, would actually see as helping to underpin the evaluation of efforts that are taken to reduce harm, and then the translation into policy. So we're at an important developmental time in terms of the research, but I think it's quite obvious that the more why do you advertise? You advertise to change behaviour. The more you expose children to those messages, the more likely they are to absorb them. And just from personal experience, I took my grandson to a football match, and I was just horrified by the amount, despite everything that's said to be done, the amount of advertising for gambling that was round the pitch on a Saturday afternoon. I think you only need to look at that. So there's a long way to go here. We know we've been successful in public health with tobacco, with alcohol. We need to be successful with gambling.
Thank Thank you, Margaret. Did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it is incredibly difficult from a research perspective to actually measure the impact of advertising across the board. This is not just in gambling. I think this is a struggle that researchers have, and this, you know, and there was a really useful commentary that was published last week by dozens and dozens of the academics who work in gambling and in public health to say, actually, you know, this argument that there's an absence of research is, you know, it's a flawed argument, because there's no evidence of safety either. So, you know, you need to look at both sides of this. I think in terms of what there is evidence for, what we can say is there is a dose-response effect. The more that people see advertising, the more they participate in gambling, right? So we do know that. We also know that for some groups, some vulnerable groups, particularly those who are recovering from having issues with gambling, it does induce them to participate in gambling more. We also know that, and when we talk about marketing and advertising, it can be quite a narrow view. You need to be talking about sponsorship here and promotions. We do know that, you know, people being exposed to promotions does also increase participation in gambling. So we do have those, you know, those blocks, foundational blocks in the research. There is more research being done, but the argument that we need to know everything before we do anything is a completely flawed one, and not one that we would stand by in any other area of public health. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Can I expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, go for it.
So we're talking about, I think if we look at it from a peripheral part of marketing and sponsorship, you know, there's the rise of influencer and crypto-based gambling. Now, this is a whole different kettle of fish, because we're coming out the realms of what we're seeing on TV. Now, this is influencer-based marketing, because the links of gaming and gambling are very much tied. So what we're now seeing is celebrities, online influencers, influencing the young generation with cryptos to bet copious amounts, and now they're being influenced a form of marketing which is going to allow them also to go into this potential from a low risk into high risk. That's my two bit.
Yeah, good point. And obviously we've seen recently the strong public support for an increase in restrictions. I think about 77% of the public, over 12,000 adults, said they would be in favour. Do you think that is a signal that perhaps it's time, even with the kind of deficit in research that people have suggested, that both the government and Mayor do more to restrict advertising? That's anyone on the panel. I'd suggest maybe external guests first, because I'm going to come to you guys next.
Personally, I'd like to see that, but I mean, again, as Marguerite says, it has to make sense that the advertising is impacting on behaviour without all the research evidence behind. And I think that this needs to be raised at least as a discussion point, and at least as something that people in general talk about. And I don't know what statistics you're quoting there, I'm afraid, Emma, that say that the public mood has changed, but I think that's something that could be looked at. And if the public mood is changed, we know from other public health campaigns that it is the time to push. And I can't believe it's not a time to push, particularly with the link to the cost of living crisis, and actually making sure that the priority is given to those groups who are most affected. So I personally would like to see more done on this front.
Yeah, short answer is yes. Particularly, I mean, I think the local government and the mayor is probably limited in what they can do. Obviously, we've seen the high fat, high sugar ban on TfL and in Haringey and other local authorities. But again, it's going back to the evidence, and what we hear locally from people we speak to is around that harm, particularly to children and young people. So that would be a clear kind of target for me if we're looking at advertising and exposure around children and young people. Thank you.
So if we talk about the evidence base, I'm going to go straight into what Mayor Sadiq Khan said, which is in May 2021, which was, given the devastating way gambling addiction can destroy lives and families, to instruct TfL to bring forward plans to extend the ban to harmful gambling. Now, in 2020 to 2021, just from April to June, there were over 61 gambling adverts on the TfL itself, and they were seeing a rise of crypto, which was sort of linked as well. So, if anything, if we have to hold true to our word. So, forget the evidence. When people are saying this, it needs to be put into action.
Thanks, Harj. That's a nice segue to come back to Tom and Vicky and ask why has the Mayor not yet implemented his commitment to restrict gambling ads on TfL network? And is it still the plan?
Yes.
And
Thank you, yeah. So the commitment which Sadiq made, is something which he still holds true to, and but what we're trying to make sure we do it in a way which is evidence-based, and is we know will be subject to legal challenge, and we want to make sure we do it in a way whereby we can resist any legal challenge accordingly and delay it. What we have therefore tried to do is, first of all, collect as much evidence as possible. And I think colleagues are right, is that you're never going to have 100% of the evidence necessarily when you start. And when we did the high fat, sugar and salt, we built into our advertising ban an evaluation at the same time to use that ban to collect the evidence. So therefore we've done our commission research. And next stage, there's two things which are outstanding. The first thing is having a nationally agreed definition of what is harmful gambling, because that is the thing which we had with the high fat, high sugar, high salt, when there was a nationally accepted consensus of what are foods which are high fat, high sugar, high salt, and you can say, right then, we're going to restrict advertising on those, but not ones which aren't fulfilling that category. We've asked the government now to develop that definition. We've asked public health partners to develop that definition, because I don't think it would stand up to legal challenge if we said this is our definition in the GLA, because my sense is that will fall at the first hurdle. So that's one thing. And the second thing is the evidence to say, can we have enough information as possible to link the advertising that you have on the TfL network with that if you reduce it, you'll have a reducing effect on the prevalence of harmful gambling and the normalisation of gambling. And I think Sian is right. There is that instinctive feeling is, why would a gambling company spend absolute millions advertising if it didn't think it would have an effect to increase people participating in gambling? So there is that instinctive feeling that there must be that reason for why they're gambling. So what we've done now, and I in fact wrote to the government recently asking them to come forward as quickly as possible with that definition of categories of gambling that are linked to most harm, to allow us then to move to the next step, as we did with high fat, high sugar, high salt, to then use the TfL network to act accordingly and do just what Harj said, which we do intend to do once that evidence is collected, once that definition is made, and we will move as swiftly as possible. What I don't think you would want me to do is do something which cost millions in legal challenges and not move the dial one little bit. And I'm trying to make sure we can do that. But I see the devastating effect of harmful gambling all the time, and I am just as committed as I was in 2021, but I want to make sure we do it, we get it right, and it actually is effective.
Thank you. I've got lots of follow-ups at the moment on research and that harmful bit, but I'm going to pass over so I don't tread on any toes, hopefully.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Tom, it sounds, all this kind of dancing on the head of a pin about what is harmful, what adverts are harmful, and the most harmful adverts. I think we've been hearing very clearly from the questions that Assembly Member Best was just putting that the people advertising gambling do it because they know that they get customers from doing that. We have heard from everyone on the panel about the harms, the public health harms that come from gambling. So, I think what I'm hearing, and I get that you don't want to have expensive legal challenges, but it feels like there's sort of there's very clear voices saying that actually preventing these adverts on the tube is going to make a difference in terms of public health and gambling. So Yes, so, why are you... I suppose one question is, why did the Mayor only commit to restrict the harmful gambling adverts? And kind of, do you think that it makes sense to only be trying to prevent the harmful gambling when actually what we're hearing is that for some people, any gambling is harmful?
Thank you for that. So one thing I would like to say at the start before I try to embark on an answer is that, so I was quite grateful for the invite today, because usually when I'm at a committee meeting like this, it's a bit of a scrutiny session. And I thought it'd be great this meeting because there's so many experts around the table, and we're at that stage in this policy area of getting that evidence, getting that advice. So that's why I'm quite keen to hear from others. And when we get the report, which hopefully you'll eventually write, we're going to use that to try to bring this policy forward. One thing I would say is that, I'm sure some people here, I've heard mutterings already today, that gamble on the national lottery. And so for large amounts of the population, gambling can be, a normal part of their social system, which they enjoy doing, and it doesn't cause them harm. And we've got to take a view about, do we try to say all gambling is harmful, and we're going to therefore identify all gambling advertising and say, therefore, any gambling, like cigarette smoking, is a good example. You cannot smoke safely. 1 cigarette a year is dangerous. But I don't think we've got the same view of people who gamble, once or twice a year on the Grand National or the National Lottery once a month, etc. And that's why we had to decide. We chose the word harmful gambling because the idea was that we want to look at the gambling which we know either is more likely to cause harm, or gambling or betting shops are gambling in a way whereby it's in areas where we know we want to target our restriction. So I know for you it feels like dancing on the head of a pin. For us, we're trying to make a balanced approach of evidence and also identifying that there are some people, many people in the UK, 50% of people who gamble, that for them, for the majority of those people, it's an activity of a social engagement, social participation that they enjoy. And I don't think it's our role or the Mayor's role to say, all you gamblers have to stop. National Lottery has to finish. Our view is very much to try to say, just as in high fat, high sugar, high salt, we didn't ban the advertising of all food, we banned the advertising of harmful food. We are keen not to ban the advertising of all gambling, only harmful gambling. And we've had that process already for high fat, high sugar, high salt, which we believe we were proved right. The evaluation showed the reduction in calories per family per week and the most deprived families. So we're trying a similar policy.
What's the equivalent of the high-fat salt sugar with gambling? How do you, because presumably people, and I think we need to broaden out the people answering this question, but presumably gambling on the National Lottery might actually lead into what you'd call maybe the fixed odds betting gambling and the stuff that is kind of addictive and potentially harmful. How does that define in terms of the gambling adverts?
So what we've asked, and I'll bring in Vicky or Alice later, and other colleagues, because I do want to hear from you rather than you want to hear from me as a GP expert on this, is the identify what we had in the high fat, high sugar, high salt. It was led by public health consultants, and we've got 4 here today, whereby there was a national consensus around the UK to say this food, we can identify it, we can define it, and we can say, we can therefore, when we are literally taking a company goes, oh, I want to advertise my X on the TfL, and we can have a process which says that is harmful. We don't have that definition at the moment, and I'm hoping from colleagues around the table, we will develop that over the next few months to allow us to move this policy forward. Without that, we believe that we will get legal challenge, which will mean that it will be stuck in the courts rather than making a difference for the Londoners.
Okay, I'm going to bring Vicky in briefly because you indicated, and then I'm going to broaden out.
Thank you, Dan.
So it was just to reflect on a profiling model. Food is complex. So the nutrition profiling model was that, and it was sort of slightly deconstructing the foods and then reassembling them in terms of the harm that they can cause. So in principle, something like that. If you think of something like tobacco and the journey we've been on, from very high-risk products, high tar, that were banned very early on, advertising restrictions, so the regulation of industry, keeping pace with that evidence, what evidence that we have that industry and with the ability to act on what we already know about harmful products, that hasn't really got momentum. So the idea of a sort of profiling tool maybe, would be interested to hear what colleagues think of that. The other thing is just to put on the table, which we didn't pick up under the health and equality, is the health and equalities elements of this. So coming back to, we're not just looking for evidence at a whole population level, 50% of Londoners gambling, 4% experiencing harm, this is the answer. We have to think about equity and health inequalities. And we have some really stark paradoxes around who is participating, leaning towards white, in good mental health, in employment, can afford to have a tipple, versus where the harm is falling, and that has to influence our policy. So the harm is falling disproportionately on people with mental health problems, people in unemployment, people living in deprived areas. So the policy also has to take that into account. And ideally we'd be bringing those two together, the profiling of the product and the harm, transparency from industry about data. So we have Kantar data about what people buy, what they take home, what they consume. Do we have the equivalent for the products that people are buying? Yeah, industry transparency about where the money is, where the behaviours are, where those product consumption is happening, alongside the inequalities elements. Yeah, because if we're going to lean into where it's unfair, preventable, disproportionate burden on different communities, that needs to inform the policy as well.
So are you thinking about a sort of geographic
well, the data would say for some of that is, leaning into deprivation and poverty. They may be participating less in gambling, but that is where the harm is falling. Some of that is geographical. But we also know black and minority ethnic communities disproportionately impacted, as we've described, much less likely to participate, but much overrepresented in harm. Mental health, and that horrible cycle, disproportionately represented there. You'd go at that from a different perspective, maybe, around presentations through the health and care system. Yeah, so if you're doing the whole policy for London, you'd need to take those policy considerations into account, and we would want to think about them also in advertising policy terms as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, Harj, I'm going to bring you in now, and I suppose the broad question is, do you think the Mayor should consider a total ban on gambling adverts across Transport for London network, which would be similar to what they did in Bristol City Council, rather than just restricting the harmful adverts? And do you think it's possible to distinguish between the harmful and the not so harmful?
My honest answer is yes. They should ban any adverts that are linked towards gambling. Now, I understand what Tom is saying, but if we look at just the statistics around this, well, we're saying that there's the ban on the health-related thingies, but then we have to look at who's the producer of those foods. Well, it's the betting operators. So the problem here is that there's a 1.5 billion economic burden on the UK government. So if we can't stop them, why can't we not restrict them? Because there seems to be a Wild Wild West thing going here with the betting operators, which is allowing them free fall just to do what they want in terms of no spending caps, no minimisation. So if we really want to cause a minimisation, why don't we go to the producers of what's happening, which are the betting operators? Because as a result, by just squashing down and by reducing the minimisation of what we're seeing out there, is one more step in a direction. For me, it's a simple solution to a bigger problem. And I get this, there's so many different ways that we have to look at certain things, but just by taking the approach of, well, no, there has to be an element of betting operators or gambling companies can't do X in terms of spending. And one of those is, why not just get rid of it from TfL? That is just a different way of trying to get away from just constantly seeing these operators pushing down this message of betting down your throat or in your face.
Do you think that people are because I mean I've noticed recently on Twitter or X that sort of gambling adverts are just popping up all the time, and I never click on them, but they're there. Do you think that the adverts are that it's more of an online problem, or do you think that the physical environment is important?
Both, because obviously the online space is allowing more eyes, so there's more awareness online. However, we still have to look at where are the places that people are more, on a place where there's a lot more people. Now, when we look at the tube coming in this morning, the whole tube was packed, and I saw 2 adverts on it this morning. So for me, that's just an inclination where you're seeing built-up areas. I haven't even talked about the land-based, bookmakers, but the more you're seeing these adverts, the more you see something, the more you're going to pay attention to that, and that's what they prey on. And the people that are in the most vulnerable state, coming back to cost of living crisis, not able to afford, employment rates going down, it's a way for them. I've seen betting adverts talking about how to use bingo to make money. It's not the right way of advertising. I get the social element of it, and I understand that there's business behind it, but it doesn't become a business when it becomes a way to make money and revenues.
Will, can I bring you in here from that sort of public health point of view? Have you got views on the Bristol City Council ban on adverts, and I think they banned all adverts, and kind of rather than and do you think it's possible to kind of make that harmful, not so harmful distinction?
I think it's nuanced, isn't it? So I don't know the huge detail of what happened in Bristol, but I think whatever we do, so if we were to do that, to do any policy, it takes investment of time and resources to do that policy. So what will the impact of that policy be? So like in our local teams, we only have a limited amount of resource to do things on gambling. We only have limited levers, so where do we focus our efforts? It would be the same at London level, it would be the same at national level. So I would like to see a little bit more of, if we're going to do this, will it have evidence of impact? Intuitively, it seems yes, that's the right thing to do, but I do think we need a further look. And the point around challenge is a really good one, because even local authorities who've done things around high fat, sugar, salt on their advertising, there is the potential for challenge. We see that when we try and restrict local gambling licenses, there's huge potential for challenge. Yep. Is it better? Is it more useful to advocate for this nationally? Because actually this is something probably that would have a lot of impact if it was done at national level. So the TFL, if you're exposed, if you watch a football match and you see what's the number, huge amounts of gambling adverts in the football match, what is the differential impact of doing that on TFL? Is it better to put our efforts into doing something much more universal? That would be my, thinking of public health perspective. Evidence, if we do this, what are we not doing? And then what is the best level to do this at? But intuitively, yes.
Thank you. Marguerite, I'm going to bring you in now, and I wonder if you, the Bristol ban was mentioned earlier, and also we heard about the Sheffield and Glasgow University studies. So I wonder what assessment has been made of these, and whether you think that's got anything to contribute to this discussion about what we could be doing here in London.
Yeah, and if I could just bring in a point on something that's been mentioned earlier about kind of this, I think what being discussed is some form of kind of index of harm, as opposed to a definition of harmful gambling, because actually it's really a confusing way to, harmful gambling is actually a term that we use to anyone who's gambling at levels that have a negative impact. One of the things to bear in mind around this conversation in terms of what is harmful gambling and what isn't harmful gambling is actually people don't gamble on one thing alone. Actually, when you look at the characteristics of people who are experiencing harms from gambling, they are more likely to be gambling on 2 or more activities. So you can't really do it in that way. You have to consider it in the whole in terms of gambling. And when they were developing the lower risk gambling guidelines in Canada, which they based on a meta-analysis of 104 studies, that's what they said. They said the uptake and harm was at 2 or more activities. But if you look at the Health Survey for England, it shows that a lot of those who are experiencing problems with gambling are gambling on 7 or more activities. So how would you then divide that up? That you become quite difficult to would you create a metrics of harm and then add them together? I mean, it would become quite complicated. So it's something to bear in mind that when you talk about gambling, people try to kind of talk about one or the other. I mean, there are characteristics of gambling products that make them more are characterized as being more harmful. Those that you can play fast, where you can bet lots of money. But gambling online, but it's not as easy cut as one is bad and one is less bad in that sense, because they can be being used together and they can affect each other. But in terms of the assessment of the evidence out there, I mean, there was a very live debate and discussion around advertising bans in the development of in the consultation that DCMS ran. In the development of the gambling white paper, ultimately they took the decision that they, at this point, nationally didn't want to do an all-out ban. But that's what's happened here. There are other countries, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy. They have brought in bans. Some of them total bans, some of them bans in sports. This is happening across the world in other jurisdictions. This isn't something that we're doing in isolation. I think. Yeah, the Bristol ban. It will be the evaluation of that and how it has an impact will be incredibly important to you, I think. But also, like, the learnings you can take from bans that have happened in comparable public health areas. I feel like always we're talking about things in silos, and there's no need. We know that advertising has the same impact on people in various different ways, and we don't need to look at this in isolation. And it's worth also bearing that in mind. You obviously have had a ban on fast foods. There's learnings to be taken from that. There are comparabilities between these different commodities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, I'm just aware we're slightly running over time at the moment, so I've just got one final question, which is for Vicky and Tom, which is just quite a practical question, which is, do you know how much revenue TfL currently generates from gambling adverts on the network? And do you have any assessment of the projected loss of revenue if restrictions were imposed?
Right, we do have, I think Alice is now hopefully looking for the figures as we speak. Regarding, Alice will come back in a second on that thing. I think it's probably page 26. But regarding loss of revenue, one thing which I would not necessarily expect a massive loss of revenue. But only from my experience of the high fat, sugar and salt. Because what we found, in fact, there was a similar concern, and believe me, there were many more adverts at the time for foods high fat, sugar and salt. And what happened was that those companies chose to advertise their healthier food options. Mm-hmm. So it was a win-win. So we didn't lose any revenue, but in fact we got advertising for food types that we really wanted Londoners to eat. So, there is often, an unpredictability when you do these things, and sometimes a benefit. Alice, do we have the figures?
Do you want to go for it?
So for last year, 22-23, it was £663,640.
Sorry, 663,000.
Just under £250,000.
Thank you. Great. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Boff.
I think there's a general consensus now that advertising works. How much is TfL spending on public health messages related to gambling?
I don't have that figure.
Is there anything?
I don't know. So, but what I can do is get you that figure.
Well, we've got the Director of Public Health here, so how much are we spending on the TfL estate for positive messages regarding gambling?
In terms of the public health unit, we do not commission gambling. We don't commission advertising promotion campaigns. Okay. We can take away to check that, but as far as I'm aware, nothing.
Perhaps I could ask Ms. Griffiths how much advertising space has TfL offered you for advertising positive messages about getting rid of gambling addiction?
I'm sorry, I'd have to take that question away as well.
Can you remember any instance of where TfL
I can't remember
has offered
TfL offering space for gambling messages, but that's probably not the way we work, so that could be why. But it would be perhaps an opportunity for us to talk to TfL and see if they would offer us any space.
I mean, you agree that gambling works, that's why the gambling companies...
Gambling advertising, I think, well...
Gambling advertising, well, advertising works. Yes. You agree, and so it seems curious that we're not using that very same medium to propose to put forward public health messages about gambling. Don't you think that's a bit odd?
I think there are some national campaigns, for example, the stigma campaign that's currently being run by GambleAware, which is on various forms of media, because I think we've mentioned the fact that people tend to see a lot more about gambling on X or on their phones. And there's quite a big push at the moment on the stigma, because another thing we've also talked about today is the fact people don't come forward. People see gambling, it's not discussed generally, and particularly... I think Harj made the point about men, particularly from certain communities, won't come forward for help, even if they have a problem.
Do you think they might come forward a bit more if they knew about the services through advertising?
Yes, and I think, so I think the current stigma campaign that's running from GambleAware is about trying to reduce the barriers to people understanding that it's the gambling, not the gambler.
I see your advertisements on, on television. Usually attached to a Paddy Power.
No, that's not our advertisements. That is a real problem. I'll go down a sidetrack if I go down that one.
We've got another session on that. But don't you think...
Andrew, I've just checked, so therefore, for all gambling adverts on the TfL website, we make sure the GambleAware website logo are attached so that people who are reading that advert are also aware that GambleAware, the organisation which Sian represents, is part of that advert.
You don't ensure that, do you? That's the advertising standards people.
So it's the Committee of Advertising Practice Code and the TfL policy.
This isn't TfL. No. I'm asking, you see, as far as I can see, TfL or the Mayor is all in favour of banning things but not promoting anything. We've seen a very effective campaign, for example, on advertising on the tube with regard to sexual harassment of women on the tube, and I think it's been, on the whole, I think it's been quite successful. And yet we don't seem to do anything in terms of positive messages either on obesity or on gambling awareness. Don't you think it would be a good idea if that message about seeking help, about being aware of gambling, is something that the TfL could dip into its pockets for in order to support?
As I said at the beginning of this discussion, I'm really here to find advice and guidance from experts around the panel. Obviously, the TfL's choice to, advertise for certain public health campaigns is something which we would be linked to. And what I will do, from your comment, Andrew, I think it is a sensible point. I will take it back. And
I just think the knee-jerk reaction of banning things rather than trying to do something positive would be something that the Mayor should take to heart. And if you can send that message back, that would be great, because we've, as far as I can see from what the evidence you've given me, apart from not being sure on some things, is we don't do any of it at all.
So I think your point...
Ms Hobart, sorry, you contradict me too.
Sorry, so I think your comment about a knee-jerk reaction is probably a bit unfair about banning, because I think what I've tried to describe today is in fact how we've been trying to be quite considered about if we were to ban harmful gambling advertising, and it's not a knee-jerk response at all. In fact, it's a considered response. Thank you, Vicky.
Hobart, you wanted to...
I just wanted to make the comment about for proactive advertising and promotion and the evidence base for what that is, what the impact of that is, so being clear strategically why that would happen. So I'd just point to examples like work, say, around active travel, say, that carries health benefits. So in terms of proactive messaging around reducing gambling harm, and promoting that through kind of communications campaigns, we'd want to be clear what the evidence base for that was. And that feels fairly limited from my understanding, but Sian may differ around, we can promote awareness of, if you're struggling with your gambling, there are debt advice services. If you're struggling with gambling, there are addiction services. But, advertising as a way of reaching those people, I'm not clear that the evidence base is that strong on that to justify an investment, a proactive investment in that route. And that's a little bit of where we've been so far around linking messages where the risk of harm is. So you're promoting gambling and you're saying, gamble responsibly, or, debt advice is available, or, if you're addicted, phone this number. The evidence for that in reducing harm is not particularly strong.
I think, thank you very much for, I'm going to press on now because we're now already 15 minutes late. No, I think we can press on.
Would I be able to send in some written questions?
Yes, you
I think
can.
I was quite kind in not asking any of them to allow Caroline to speak.
Well, I think I allowed one of your colleagues to come in, okay, and I think that we are all 15 minutes late, right? Okay, I need to press on. Otherwise, we'll be here in another oversight meeting. So I'm going to ask, but I'll just ask a question. The question which just arose to me is the evidence between what's more effective to promote something or to ban the thing happening in the first place. I mean, it's this question about, is prevention better than cures, right? Okay, and that debate may always take place. But I can ask the question.
Okay, so am I not? Do you want me to answer that or not?
No, I'll write it down. But the question came to my mind anyway. Okay, we will ask the question. Okay. Can I go over to Corporation Rani, please?
Thank you, Chair. So the next set of questions are on land-based gambling in particular. So first of all, I'd like to turn to Marguerite just to ask an open question really on which Londoners are more likely to use gambling premises in person rather than gamble online, and what harms may be more associated with those who gamble in person.
Unfortunately, we don't have that information at a national level. I mean, as I was saying earlier, in terms of online and land-based gambling, it isn't that there's people who are doing one and not the other necessarily. People are participating in a multitude of gambling. There is a move away from online gambling in general. The numbers have been decreasing. We did see a bounce back after COVID. But one of the things we do know is that gambling premises are more likely to be found in areas of higher deprivation, and we also know that people living in areas of higher deprivation are less likely to gamble but are more likely to experiencing gambling-related harm. But in terms of the constitution of who those people are that are gambling online or gambling in person, unfortunately I don't have that information, and maybe some of our colleagues who've worked can talk anecdotally about what we know from different boroughs, but we don't have that picture, I'm afraid.
Harj?
So just going back onto what Marguerite is saying, so if we look at the City of London as a Met, it has 32 betting shops just in a small confined area. Westminster as a Met Borough has 79 bookmakers in a small space area. Now, if we look at the links, we're saying, well, nearly 3/4 of consumers say that they don't want these bookmakers on their high street places. But more importantly, yes, we've seen the rise of online gambling. And according to Gambling Commission in 2020, they say land-based gambling accounts for 44% of the 10.2 billion gross gambling yield, the GGY. So it's almost contributing towards half of the revenues that industry is making. So it is prevalent because, like saying, they're preying on the people that are the most vulnerable in the rundown areas because they know they can't afford it. So they're basically preying on them. And that's why you're seeing more betting operators. I think in Slough in itself has about 42 betting shops in such a small space.
I'll turn to Vicky first.
Very quick point, I suppose. Why don't we know? Just put that out there. And then to reflect on how difficult that then makes it to tackle health inequalities. So when you're trying to do this on a place-based basis and make the case in your local authority for the need for action and how this is disproportionately impacting on a particular community, the lack of that data is really key and important to making the case. And then coming out of that is how does that compare to other potentially harmful products? So do we have comparable information for tobacco and for alcohol, say? This is not an illegal drug where we might not have routine routes for collecting that information. this is a legal activity. So why don't we have that information?
Sian?
Just to say, I was just checking on some of the notes that the GambleAware team gave me about research, and it definitely shows, that restricting accessibility to EGMs, electronic gaming machines, substantially reduces gambling harm and appears to be little transfer of problems to other gambling forms. Now, that's just one small study, and we should always be careful, but there is an increasing amount of work that we could pull together probably to get a better view of the EGMs and their impact and who's using them. But as others have said, we know they're concentrated in deprived areas. We know that the most deprived groups tend to use them, and that does include an increasing number of women. So there is a whole set of issues here that we need to do more research to understand the challenge.
Right. Will, before I bring you in, I just wondered also if you can reflect on the previous question, but also give some insight into the powers that London boroughs have to decide on whether to permit or block new gambling premises to open on a high street.
Thank you. So just on the first point, again, from speaking to our residents in focus groups, one of the things about betting shops, in essence, was they were sometimes seen as a warm space to go for people who are unemployed. So actually, and we see that in Haringey, that the betting shops are in those poorer areas. So there's a kind of link. You're almost seeing that vulnerability is something for people to do when they don't have other things to do. So that's why we want to kind of challenge it in a way. And we often see antisocial behaviour and things around the gambling shops as well. It can be really challenging. So in terms of what we can do, so there is the legislation on this means there should be an aim to permit gambling premises. So the legislation is, if there's an application, we should aim to permit it where possible. And there are three reasons why we can make objections. So one is preventing gambling from being a source of crime and disorder, being associated with crime. Second one is ensuring that gambling is conducted in a fair and open way, which of course most of the operators are able to demonstrate in the main that they do that. And the third one, where we make most of our objections, is protecting children and vulnerable persons from being harmed or exploited by gambling. The challenge we have in the local authority is it is very difficult to directly link causally a new or existing betting premises with any of those harms to the level of degree of evidence that would be required. We know, for example, there's more antisocial behaviour. We've talked about the impact on children from our focus groups. That is not sufficient for us to have any restrictions on gambling premises in the long run because of the aim to permit. Where we have been successful in our licensing committee in the local authority is by restricting, for example, hours of use from gaming centres, which in essence kind of mini casinos. They're not like a classic betting shop. They would just have machines. And they want to open them 24 hours, 24/7. So we've been able to restrict hours. But those restrictions are normally for the first year of operation. And once it's been open for a year, the company will come back and say, we've complied with this. You haven't shown any evidence that this is harmful. And then there is, again, that kind of aim to permit. So we are really, really limited. And this is national legislation. It's a national framework. We would really welcome the ability, I think Tom mentioned in the London plan, but again, there's no guarantee that that London have the powers to do this, where we could say no more betting shops. That's what our residents say. They want to say no more betting shops in this area. We are saturated. We would actually like to go further and say, can we attach harm to existing gambling premises as well when they come to renew licences? The other limitation for us, apart from legislation, is just the resources that we have. Everyone knows local government is really stretched, and just the amount of work it takes to put in to build the evidence against a single application is huge. Obviously, something we can do is share amongst us how we do that better. But also, for our environmental health trading standards, to go into betting shops and making sure they're complying with the things that they should do, so checks to see if they've got people who are impacted by gambling harm and then limitations. And we've seen by, I think, some fines from big betting companies that they're not always doing that. So it's hugely challenging, and it's very frustrating for our residents, because the residents think, why can't we do something about it as a local authority? And we are doing all we can, but we're very limited. Thank you.
Sorry, just on that, the aim to permit, is that from the Gambling Act 2005?
I'd have to go back to my notes, but yes, someone here might be able to answer that. I don't know. That's the broad thrust of the legislation. Yeah.
Yeah, Vicky, was that a yes?
No, I'm just saying we can confirm.
Yeah, I just wonder, because I'm equally frustrated as you are, Will. So previous to coming onto the Assembly, I was a councillor in the borough of Brent as well, and I know in terms of proliferation of some of those betting shops, Dr. Tom Coffey alluded to something at the beginning of the meeting, about 10 times as many betting shops in poorer areas in general in London. I'm just wondering if a call to government to review some of that legislation to give local authorities more power is something that we can also take forward as a suggestion based on I think, Will, what you've said in terms of the lack of powers that you have to control what's in your local area. I think back to my time on the council where councils are powerless and as a result look to exercise their power by imposing restrictions on new premises opening because they know that they won't be able to stop them completely, which is, again, not ideal in areas that have a high saturation of betting shops. Will, just in terms of the Mayor of London, what do you feel the Mayor can do to support London boroughs in managing the impact of gambling premises in London?
So firstly, I'll come back. I've just checked my notes. You're right about the Gambling Act 2005, saying the licensing authority has that sort of aim to permit. In terms of what the Mayor can do, well, I think the things that we're starting to do is kind of around partnership work and talking about this and talking about where the evidence is, how we can mitigate impacts, how we can prevent. But primarily we're talking about planning and I'm not sure of the sort of limitations. We're very limited at local government. I think the Mayor is limited in terms of the planning. So maybe some things around advocacy, as you mentioned, may be the things around the highest impact. Like how we can work together, because I think if you were putting my counterparts, the other 30-odd directors of public health, here, they would say the same thing. So how can we work together with one voice to work out what is needed and how we advocate for that?
Right, and Dr. Coffey, I think you alluded to the London plan earlier. Could you just highlight some of the work that, or the contribution that the London plan could make to this?
So the London plan gives kind of very much guidance to local authorities as to how they should approach their planning requirements for the next 10 years. And it does have to be done in conjunction with a local plan as well. So we ask for, let's say, the Borough of Haringey or Borough of Tower Hamlets, etc. I know Newham's done some great work in this field, whereby they take the London plan's recommendation. And if I read the section very quickly on the London plan, just asking its policy SD6, to promote a diverse range of users, support vitality and viability. So it's just not about social harm, it's about vitality of your neighbourhood. And over-concentration of some users, however, such as betting shops, can give rise to particular concerns regarding the impact on the mental and physical health and well-being, and the proliferation of these uses should be carefully managed through the development plan and planning decisions in town centres. So it's very much giving that steer and guide, but as Will was saying, that we can't say you have to stop this, and Alice, Vicky, and myself are working to try how we can give as much information as possible to the local authorities so they can actually implement what is in their gift, but recognising that it might be that we have to advocate for the present government or maybe even the next government to try to listen to take these actions forward, because as we've all, I think all of us across all parties have recognised the harm that gambling puts on Londoners is significant, and anything we can do to reduce that we should definitely do.
Right, and this is an open question to all panellists, anyone that wants to come in. Is there anything further that you feel the Mayor can do to prevent and reduce gambling harm in London that hasn't been mentioned already? Will?
So I suppose this is in the sphere of partnership working. So one of the things that we're doing in prevention in Haringey is we've got Red Card, actually Harj's organisation, just as a pilot coming into schools to talk about gambling and the awareness of harms and the awareness that you're being hit with advertising. I don't think this is a mayor's responsibility, but I think, you know, there is a role that we can play together in looking at how we work with schools in the education sector to ensure that those messages are getting through to our children and young people. So that would be one area.
Harj.
Yeah, so just to expand on that really, just to provide more resources, especially for people from the South Asian communities to have, you know, to work with this team, people over here to get more resources, to get more information, to get more data so we can have better unilateral formed decisions so we can make further improvements. So for me, it's to have the ability to have more resources and to work closely with people that are actually lived experience that can give you better insights.
Thank you. I'm glad you've got the focus on children as well, because another area I think I'm personally concerned about is sport and the association with online betting, especially with young people now using social media and YouTube to particularly view sporting content. It automatically, in most cases, from sort of the major TV companies, the content they have is directly advertised by sports betting companies or sports betting related advertising, and you can't escape it as a child if you want to view some of that content. So I'm glad you've got that focus. That's the end of my questioning, Chair.
Thank you. Member Boff.
How are we going to replace the social aspects of bingo halls if we decide to ban them all?
I'm not aware that we have decided, anybody's recommended banning bingo halls.
But if local authorities start adopting this attitude of just banning... I
haven't heard any local authority yet say they're going to ban a bingo hall.
But what about betting shops? Betting shops, bingo halls, what's the difference?
I think there is a big difference.
One's used by women, one's used predominantly by men.
I mean, I think you might have heard earlier, but I'll reiterate, Assemblymember Boff. So within the betting shops, we have those electronic terminals, which we said that so 46% of people using those tend to have...
You have them in bingo halls as well?
No, they do, but the betting shops, there is a wide proliferation of that. And I don't believe, and I think we're trying to have evidence here, that the evidence shows that people who are using bingo halls fall into the same category as those who use betting shops and electronic betting terminals. So that's why we're looking for the evidence, Assemblymember Boff, and to make sure that we're guided by the evidence in that public health approach. And as far as I'm aware, I've yet to hear anybody advocate what you're advocating, which is the banning of bingo halls.
Well, the betting outlets. I mean, one rule for one type of people and another rule for somebody else. I just find that difficult to explain to Londoners why you would pick on betting shops, which do provide a social aspect, as well as bingo halls.
Yeah, so that isn't the policy of the Mayor. It might be something that you'd like to consider, but it isn't something that we would. But thank you very much for recommending it.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the panel members who've contributed this morning. There may be some questions we may have to ask, which we haven't had time to ask in the open session, but if we can write to you. Are you happy to answer them? Great. So we may write some questions to you. I'm going to adjourn this for 10 minutes so we can reassemble the second panel. But thank you very much to all of you who've contributed this morning. Thank you very much. Welcome back to the Health Committee, and welcome to our second panel of guests. I'm going to ask the panel members to introduce themselves. So let's start with you, Professor Dame Claire Garada.
Right. I'm Claire Gerarda. I'm a general practitioner in South London, and I'm also the head of a service called the Primary Care Gambling Service, which is a UK-wide service.
Hi, I'm Emma Christie. I'm Head of Mental Health for NHS England's London region, and our role in relation to the Gambling Harms programme is working with our national team, and we have a role to support services during mobilisation and make sure that those are meeting the needs of all the kind of local health geographies in London.
I'm Matthew Hickey. I'm Chief Executive of Gordon Moody. Gordon Moody provides residential treatment for those most affected by their gambling. We run centres, residential centres across the country, taking residents from Scotland, Wales and England.
Good, thank you.
Good morning. My name's Mark Weiss. I'm Director of Communications with GambCare, and GambCare is and has been for 25 years the leading provider of treatment and support for anyone affected by gambling harm.
Thank you. Is Professor Henrietta Bowen?
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm able to hear you now. Thank you. So, hi everyone. Sorry about the tech difficulties. I'm Professor Henrietta Bowden-Jones. I'm the Director of the National Problem Gambling Clinic, and I'm also NHS England's National Clinical Advisor on Gambling Harms.
Thank you, and welcome to all the panel members. I'll start kicking off with the question, then my colleagues will come in. My first question is, of course, to you, Professor Henrietta Bowden-Jones. Are you seeing an increase or decrease in the number of people in London suffering from gambling-related health harms in recent years? And if so, what's behind the change?
Well, thank you for this question. The opportunity of speaking today at the London Assembly allowed us to really explore the numbers coming in over the last 3 years or so. I will say there has been a slight increase. However, it's not a scientific process. What happens is that the self-referral, the referral by GPs or by mental health teams to our clinic is really as much linked to profile of gambling in a particular year, the gambling harms, things that are happening that may lead people to come forward and request help. So we are now at about 108. In fact, in the last year, it's been 183 people coming from London out of the 430 people we've been referred over the year. To give you an idea, it was about 45 people less 2 years ago. So we are seeing an increase, but scientifically speaking, this is not necessarily something that has evidence base. It could be that, you know, if there was to be enough a focus on gambling within London with campaigns, etc., to make sure people understood what gambling harms meant and how they were exhibited, we could go much, much higher, I have no doubt. But certainly the ability to provide free treatment available to all is a key to knowing how big is the issue in London.
Thank you. And Matthew, did you have a view on this?
Yes. Firstly, thanks for inviting us in. And secondly, over the last 10 years, Gordon Moody has had around, well, pretty much 1,000 people apply for treatment in a residential setting. That said, since 2020, applications have risen from 52 in 2020 right the way through to 137 in 2023, and that has been an incremental increase per year since 2020. So I would agree with what Henrietta has said. I think And we know that the awareness of gambling-related harms and the fact that there is treatment out there has gone from very, very low level to just very low level, and there is still a long way to go to raise the awareness within the public that there is treatment out there for their problem gambling.
Yeah. And Mark, did you have a view on this?
Thank you, and again, we're delighted to be here at GambCare and invited to the panel. So I'll answer this question in two different ways. I'm going to talk in a general level around general level of harm in London, and then I'll talk about what we're seeing in our own services. So data on London from the annual GB, or for the UK, for the annual GB treatment and support service, shows that London has the lowest rate of gambling participation in the GB, but it has the highest level of problem gambling. And I just caveat that word problem gambling. It's a term that we'll use today in the session, but it is important that we get the language right here, because our language can be stigmatizing, but in a technical sense, in the sense of the data, the highest levels are on the PGSI score. 16.5% of people score 1, which is about 1.2 million people in London. 5.6% a PGSI score of 8 and above. We also know that demand for support is higher in London, with 30.5% of people with a PGSI score of 1 and above stating that they would like support, advice and treatment. And it's probably worth also mentioning that there are a disproportionate number of minoritized communities that are affected. So it's twice the number of people in the bottom 3 decile of deprivation compared with the top 3. And I could go on about some of that perhaps in a moment, but in terms of what we're seeing here at GambCare, as part of the National Gambling Support Network, we deliver treatment across London. In Q1 of 2023 to 2024, we had 284 referrals into service, 211 clients starting Tier 2, that's evidence-based interventions, and that was a 65% increase on the previous year. 136 clients starting structured treatment, Tier 3 treatment, and that's a 37% increase on the previous year. So we are seeing in our service an increase.
Claire, yes?
Yeah, thank you. We've only been in operation, we started literally on the day the pandemic started, so we were slightly, had to adapt our service. So we've really got 2 years data where we've been 2 years fully clinical, and around a quarter of our patients are from London. And bear in mind we're England, well, we're UK-wide, and that represents about 150 out of the 600 that we've had. It is rising. We're working very, very hard. The original model of our service was to engage with GPs in their surgeries, right in the heart of their clinics. But of course, that was paid to by the pandemic. So we're working hard to engage with GPs in order that they can start to identify people who might have problems, for example, through domestic violence, through debt, through depression, through anxiety. And we work very, very closely with the third sector. So we act as their sort of risk sink, if you like. So our referrals are increasing. If you're going to say whether London is increasing or decreasing, I think, as Henrietta Bowden-Jones says, it is dependent on several background issues, including, you know, things like the World Cup and big sporting tournaments. So, but I think there's, as you've heard, scope for improvement, given that the prevalence of even the lower end of gambling, but let alone the upper end, is much, much more than the amount of patients we're seeing between us.
Yeah, I know we're going to pick up general practice and their role specifically later on. Just, Mark, to come back to you. Sorry, did you want to make a comment, Emma, at all at this stage?
No, I'm fine not to comment at this point.
Thank you. Mark, I was just going to come back to what proportion of people suffering from gambling harms are in treatment, and how does this compare to the proportion of people suffering, say, from alcohol or substance misuse in treatment?
I think it is fair to say, and I'll come back to the committee with the numbers on that, but I think what we see is that there is a disparity between the two. The number of people who are accessing treatment is relatively quite low compared to those accessing treatment for drug and alcohol services. I think there's quite a big disparity.
Right, okay. And just so another question, does gambling addiction, right, exist on its own purely, or is it always coexistent with other conditions also?
I might defer to my clinical.
Maybe I can pick that up. We've had one patient who has a purely gambling problem, i.e. what you would traditionally think of gambling. By the way, the reason why people don't come forward as much as they might with alcohol or drugs is the enormous stigma around gambling, even themselves. And GambleAware did a very good survey quite recently which looked at the individual themselves feels that they're so ashamed that they're spending their family money or whatever, that they don't come forward. With respect to what we're seeing, as I said, only two. The vast majority have comorbidities. Some have 3, 4 or 5 different comorbidities, and that's physical as well as mental health, association with drug and alcohol misuse, but also with schizophrenia, with learning difficulties, homelessness. It isn't your traditional footballers gambling their enormous wealth, which you might think is just an isolated. So it's a misnomer to think of gambling as, I think, as a single entity. And in my experience of working with drug, alcohol, right through, I've worked with crack cocaine, this is by far the worst, the most hidden and the most destructive of all the addictions, including the reason why people don't come for treatment.
Thank you. Matthew, you want to come in?
Sorry. Difficult for me to. It's hard for me to see when you want me to come. Wait until you say my name.
I'm going to come back to you just in a minute, right? But let me just take Matthew, then I'll come back to you. Okay, thank you.
100% agree with everything that Claire has just said. What we see in London specifically is that over 50% of our applicants have a comorbid mental health diagnosis. Most commonly, this is depression, anxiety, PD, PTSD, ADHD. That said, all of them will have drug and alcohol issues as well. Some of those are severe. Some of those are manageable. We have cases where individuals are taking cocaine to keep themselves up for longer so that they can gamble for longer. So 10, 15 lines of cocaine a day, using marijuana to balance that off, and then using alcohol to balance that as well. So they are using other substances to maximise the length of time that they can gamble for.
Thank you. Okay, Henrietta, did you want to comment on the?
Yes, I do, very much so. Thank you. So, just to get back to your original question, what we know is that due to the historical lack of coverage in terms of services across the whole country, and the stigma attached to gambling disorder, as Claire was saying, we have had very low numbers of people needing treatment, actually accessing treatment, and I can say that until very recently, that figure was roughly 5% of the people who need interventions. So that's the first thing to say. Secondly, I absolutely agree with all of the comments made by my colleagues around the table. I won't repeat, I'm just in support of everything, but I will also talk to you for a second about bidirectionality. So there's all of that going on with a comorbidity, but then gambling makes things worse. So, what we do know, and this has come to the fore very much in the last few years, we know that mood worsens because of the enormous harm caused by gambling in all areas of life, be they relationships, be they financial, obviously, professional, academic, you name it. And so we are now aware of large numbers of suicides that are associated with gambling harms. And I really want the panel to be aware of this. There have been various reports done by different research groups showing that there is a large confidence interval, but nevertheless, it's still potentially up to 500 people a year in this country are trying to take their own lives, are taking their own lives because of gambling-related harms. So the depression and the anxiety and everything else that may at times be coexistent is absolutely worsened by the harms caused by gambling, the isolation that leads people to feel unable to cope. So that was my real bit I wanted to add.
Thank you for that. Thank you. But my next question was to you, Henrietta. Anyway, does the National Problem Gambling Clinic currently have capacity to meet the demand for people suffering from gambling, particularly from London?
So, well, first of all, the clinic, which is based in London, is one of a network of currently 12, soon to be 15 clinics. But the most important thing to tell you is that really the NHS network is very much looking towards close collaboration with the primary care, with specialist services such as the services run by Claire and all of the voluntary organisations round the table. So we only really at the moment, by the end of 2024, we'll have capacity for 3,000 treatment episodes. Now, 3,000 is nothing compared to where we have to end up, which is really, I'm hoping, somewhere in the next 3 years, I'm hoping we'll aim for 30,000 treatment episodes. So clearly the capacity for the clinic to deal with London presentations is there at the moment and will increase further. But it's really working in collaboration with voluntary sector and organisations throughout the country that we are going to be able to explore need. I'm hoping that, particularly in London, since we're speaking to you today, we will be able to pilot some raising of profile of gambling harms. We're going to pilot some potential blocking of exposure to gambling harms, such as adverts on the tube, adverts on buses, things that are clearly going to be causing a harm to people who may start gambling and may experience issues. So those, I think it's about evidence-based, is also about understanding what the need is at the time when you start piloting things, and then working out where need lies and then expanding and providing the services needed. I hope that helps.
So just one more question, Henrietta. How does one? What's the process for referring into your service? How does one access the services given by the National Problem Gambling Clinics?
Yeah. So again, as a national advisor, I'll talk to you about the whole of the NHS networks. The referral services are all the same, but of course, if we're thinking of London, then people can self-refer. We've been around since 2008. A lot of our patients, about half of them, are coming because they read about us, they look us up on the internet. But equally, GPs are more and more aware of the services being provided. The mental health teams, criminal justice system, all sorts of people are able to refer in. But the most important thing is that relatives play a big part. So all the clinics, and I'm very aware it's not just the NHS clinics, but very much our voluntary sector colleagues are also providing this. We support and help relatives of people suffering from gambling harms and are there to receive referrals for relatives as well. So many people might come because they're struggling with a son who's got a problem, or a husband or wife with a problem, and that brings into treatment the two people involved or more if needed. So it's a pretty open referral. We aim to see everyone who has a request of receiving help to tackle gambling harms. That's the best way to phrase it.
Thank you. Did you want to come in, Claire?
Yes, I would, if that's all right. I think it's important to recognise that 80% of all treatment episodes currently take place in the third and voluntary sector. And whilst the NHS services are really good, by the time you've reached an NHS treatment centre service, you could say that it's too late. You already have an entrenched. What our service does is it sits in the middle. It's primary care led, GP led. We link with the medical record. We link with the GP medical record. We link with digital.
My colleague is very clearly going to explore GPs with you.
Okay,
Claire.
I just wanted to make the point.
But I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't treading toes.
That we are aware that
GPs.
No, I was going to say the point is that 80% of treatment episodes take place in the third sector, and I think one of the comments that was that was sort of made out was that there's been poor access. I think there's been poor recording up till now, which is my experience of this. But I think that, and maybe you'll speak to the third sector now, I think that it's remiss to say that the Great White Horse, which is the NHS treatment services, means that it's all going to be all right. There's still a lot to be done.
Yes. Matthew?
There's a number of points that I can pick up from the questions that you've asked. I think, firstly, from a suicidality point of view, I would agree with what Henrietta has already said, in that 70%, some 70+% of people that come to Gordon Moody have either attempted or have seriously contemplated suicide, mainly because we are a Tier 4 service and we are, unfortunately, the last chance saloon for them. They've tried everything else, whether that be from other organisations in the third sector, whether that be within the gambling sphere or outside of that, or within the NHS. It is a last chance saloon. In terms of referral pathways, I've been Chief Executive of Gordon Moody now for 4 years. In that 4 years, when I took over, 99.9% of people self-referred. And if I'm honest, it was by luck that you found an organisation like Gordon Moody than by design. Since then, that has dropped to about 70% self-referral, and again I would say that's more by luck than by design, and I think it goes back to our comment right at the beginning around awareness and understanding. Of the other 30%, they are coming through the wider National Gambling Treatment Network, including from our partners from GambCare and from the primary care sector, but also from the NHS, and we cross-refer. Not just us as Gordon Moody, but across the piece, so that the right people are getting the right treatment by the right organisation. So if someone comes to Gordon Moody and says, I need this level of care, and it's better to be treated by GambCare, for example, then we will refer them into GambCare. In terms of capacity, 4 years ago, we were on the back foot. Always having a long waiting list of people coming in. Someone could wait to come in for at least 12 months before being treated by Gordon Moody. Since then, we've built our capacity in preparation for the onslaught, which is coming, for all of the reasons that we'll go into, including changing government policy, awareness, the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the cost of living crisis. We have moved from only being able to treat 70 people a year to some 500 people a year now.
Thank you. Mark, did you want to comment?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm delighted, and GambCare is delighted to be sitting on a panel today with both Dame Claire and Professor Bowden-Jones. Both have delivered really transformative work, and we welcome the NHS as a future Commissioner of Treatment and Support. This reflects a vital shift in recognition of gambling harm as a public health concern. It provides a potential for joined up and collaborative working, and I think that point is really important because this point about integration and collaboration should focus on the patient's needs, and so to that end, we've welcomed a productive, constructive engagement with our NHS colleagues. And I think this isn't an either-or case, as Matthew has said. The NHS does absolutely vital work for treating some of the most complex cases. But as Dame Claire said, it's also important to recognise that it's 80 to 90% of treatment and support activity is currently delivered by the third sector, with a focus on early intervention, on prevention, and recovery. And it's a really key part of the pathway. So in the third sector, we bring a significant understanding of the gambling landscape, where the need is. We have a trusted relationship with diverse communities. And I think Dame Claire mentioned the other day on Radio 4 that this is about wrapping our arms around the individual, and that is what the third sector can deliver. And it's important to also recognise the efficacy of treatment. This is evidence-based treatment delivered by trained practitioners. So what we want to try and do is make sure we're delivering for patients. And I just want to make a point here about patient choice, which is such an important part of treating addictions, because service users want to have autonomy and they want to have access to information and the ability to make informed choices about support, whether that's with the NHS or the National Gambling Support Network or any other place. And so there should be a no wrong door approach. And one of the things that we want to make sure that we don't see is an over pathologizing of treatment and support.
That my colleague will have some areas which she wanted to examine. Over to you.
Thank you. I first of all just want to raise the issue for anyone who is listening online, that if you're finding the discussion of suicide triggering, there will be various opportunities to get support and help through, for example, organisations like the Samaritans, and I assume that there will also be some mention of this on the London Assembly social media comms via Twitter. So I just wanted to say that in case that was the case for anyone who was listening. Now, we've actually sort of covered a lot of my first question, which was about the proportion of people treated for gambling harms outside of specialist NHS clinics. So Matthew and Mark, you've already said a lot about this, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything that you haven't yet said in response to Olga Sahota's questions.
I think what I would add is that over the last 3 years, Gordon Moody has grown. It has grown based on the demand which is coming forward, and a lot of that demand is because of a better integration between all services, both across the third sector and within the NHS. On top of that, awareness has increased. I kind of liken it to where mental health services were 20, 25 years ago. It's really on the resurgence. On top of that, I'd also like to say that not only is this a classic male problem, but this is also a female problem as well. And we, as an organisation who have been operating for some 52 years, have opened a specific residential service for women, albeit based in the West Midlands, but is a national service for anyone to access, which can house up to 13 women at any time who are dealing with most severe problem gambling. We are seeing a rise in applications from women. They are taking some 40% of our total applications, and over the last 4 years, our applications have risen from, albeit in that first year of my tenure, we were dealing with a pandemic. So applications were down at 270 for the year. And this year we will see well over 1,000 people apply to Gordon Moody for treatment, probably hitting 1,100, somewhere in that kind of, in that bracket. What we do see, though, is that the complexity of clients over the last 3 years has changed quite considerably. Long gone are the classic male gambler with a PGSI of 20 plus, it is the complexities that we've already talked about around the comorbidities that are coming to the fore, both from a mental health point of view and from a other substance misuse point of view. The other worrying part about gambling and why the numbers are low comparatively is that it is this hidden addiction, and really people only come forward when either they are in personal crisis, so they've been busted, for want of a better phrase, their family has found out, or they've come to the end of their tether where all other channels for dealing with their addiction have dried up. So, for example, any source of money that they may well have had has dried up. So it's at those points where people come forward in crisis. In terms of the impact of the treatment that Gordon Moody deliver, we are successful in terms of people completing treatments with some 80+% people. When you compare that to drug and alcohol, that's down in the 20th percentile. In terms of the longer term recovery, that's something which we're building more and more evidence around, and it's a very difficult one to capture, in that some people will stay involved and stay in contact, and some people will close the chapter of their life on gambling and move away and either disengage or disappear.
Can I just pick up on the issue of more women coming forward? Are they getting involved online or in the sort of physical betting shops? And is there a sort of trend on that?
Even today, the highest proportion is people betting on land-based or in land-based scenarios. In London, on average across our whole portfolio of men and women, it's about 65% do so in land-based, and somewhere in the 40 percentile around online. The online is growing, but it still is well overtaken by land-based activity. In terms of women specifically, you will find as many women in land-based as you will online, so it's about a 50% split.
Okay, that's I'd wondered if it was sort of more of a hidden thing with women, whether it was more online, but that's interesting. That
anecdotally, if you were to walk into a casino on a Tuesday afternoon, you would see as many women playing the slot machines as you would see men on the tables.
If I could just make a brief point as well, that Gambling Commission data tells us that only 1% of women experiencing gambling-related harm are calling the National Gambling Helpline. So clearly there is a lot of work to do. I mean, we provide at GambCare an excellent women's program, an outreach program, and we have forums and training and support, but there is more to be done in that space for sure.
Thank you. And just in terms, just continuing with the sort of private providers.
Could we come in on the women's side? Sorry.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Don't worry, I'm aware it's not easy, but I'm sorry, my clinic was booked before this date was set and I couldn't cancel all the patients in order to attend. But I was delighted to hear Matthew and Mark talk about women in this way. It's stressing the importance of raising the profile of female gamblers experiencing problems. I think London is no different from the rest of the country. We need to do so much more to engage women and make them feel empowered enough to come forward. Historically, what I remember from setting up the first NHS clinic over 15 years ago was that there were no women. And then gradually they trickled in and we stayed at 1 or 2% for several years. And when I tried to find out why this was, what was stopping women coming forward was an intense fear of children being taken away. Number one, being deemed to be bad mothers. Literally, this was the word, bad mothers. And I think that although we've moved somewhat away from this by trying to persuade people, the population in general, that gambling disorder is an illness like any other, is a psychiatric illness, it's an addiction like any other. Unfortunately, women are still somehow bearing that brunt of the stigmatization and fear. And of course, there is also the fact that some of our female patients are relying on their partners in terms of family finance, and they're very, very scared that being deemed to be a gambler is going to also impact on whether the marriage will continue. So I think that when you ask us what can we do, again, London-based, I think we do need to focus on empowering women to come forward for treatment and being able to actually, even now that it's digitalized, the opportunity to get treatment. It was always a fear that how would they be able to take time out of their families to come for treatment? People would notice, people would be suspicious. So that's one piece of work for the future.
Thank you very much, and again, apologies for not spotting your hand. It's very small on the screen for us. Just going back to the piece about the third sector providers, just in terms of capacity, Mark and Matthew, do you think there is capacity within that third sector space to meet the demand for services?
It's a really great question and a really difficult one to answer. I can answer from a Gordon Moody perspective, but also it's linked to how innovation and development of new programs is funded. So from a Gordon Moody perspective, we have specifically developed the organisation so that we can be on the proactive side of accepting more people, so that there isn't a waiting list for those people in crisis, so that those people who do call up about to commit suicide, unfortunately, are able to be seen and brought into treatment in the quickest possible way, making sure that all the safeguarding and quality measures are put in place before someone does enter treatment. As I said before, our capacity in terms of being able to treat people per annum has grown from some 70 people to some 300 people. And that capacity can grow again in the future. However, it needs to be demand-led, but also well-funded to do that. An organisation like Gordon Moody can be funded for the treatment side of things, but obviously we need capital funding for opening up new buildings, and that's the more difficult part for an organisation like ours, is where do you source capital funding from? Treatment funding is easier, but capital is a lot more difficult.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you very much. Yeah, just thinking about Matthew's first point, there's a question here around waiting times, and within the National Gambling Support Network, of which GambCare is a part alongside Dame Claire and Matthew, we are able to see our service users, our clients, very rapidly. So I'll check the figure. I think it may be a target time on the NGSN of 2 days to treatment. The average here at GambCare is 5 days into treatment. So one of the benefits of the third sector is the ability to see qualified, trained professionals for bespoke treatment very rapidly. To give you a sense of the scale, I mean, on the National Gambling Helpline, which is a 24/7, 365-day a year and confidential free line for anyone concerned about gambling. Over the last year, we received over 44,000 calls to the helpline, but we also delivered nearly 9,000 evidence-based interventions, and we've seen about 9,000 people in structured treatment. I mean, what we hope, and I suspect that colleagues across the table hope, is that the introduction of the levy, which will enable a scaled-up investment into the sector will enable any capacity issues, should there be any, to be addressed. But sorry, I think you wanted to come in.
The only other part that I was going to add to that is, yes, we can cope with the increased demand as a sector, and that includes the combination of the third sector and the NHS. The biggest part which worries me is, where does the workforce come from? We have a structure for drug and alcohol workers, we have a structure for social care workers, we have a structure for dealing with adult care and children's care. We do not have, at this moment in time, a structure for dealing with gambling and gambling addiction. We train our staff and develop our staff to become gambling therapists in the same way that all the other organisations do, and have that understanding, but from a support worker and therapist point of view, there is no formal qualification route yet for that to be developed, and that is something which in the future we would like to see be put in place.
So you mean more?
It might be helpful if I came in here, I don't know, because I would pick up on that in my national role. Would that be helpful?
I think Emma was just about to come in.
Oh,
so
sure,
I'll
wait my
first.
turn. You can call me in, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and just wanted to comment and reflect on some of the points that I think Mark's alluded to in terms of the levy, and it goes back to the point that Henrietta made right at the outset about that needing a kind of good open access economy of treatment services to truly start to get visibility on what the demand is and where you might not be meeting it. And I do think it's important to mention that the levy just creates that opportunity to have transparent funding flows that are properly coming in from the industry, which is making millions, billions off of this kind of really damaging public health pressure for London and for the rest of the country. And that kind of ability to have proper investment in prevention, proper earlier intervention, expansion of the specialist services where we need those, absolutely. I think we've got a decent track record, and certainly in the NHS, of establishing new workforce roles that can support delivery of certain interventions. So I think we can potentially work to use some of that funding to develop and create a pipeline of staff. But I think that kind of getting that kind of balance right in terms of how the levy board allocates that funding and making sure that it's able to put in place a broad spectrum of support, including early intervention and prevention, is really, really key.
Thank you. Now, I was also just picking up, because I think it was Matthew said, or maybe it was Mark actually, 5 days into treatment, but just what care pathways are available to patients through their GP? So, Claire.
Yeah. Can we, I get quite concerned about the use of the language, and one of the use is the pathway, and I don't think patients are sort of parcels on a, and I know everybody uses this, but they're not, and actually I've only worked with the third sector in this way properly for about 3 years, and there isn't a pathway. There's an engagement with the individual. We call them patients, they call them clients, where we wrap care around them and we move around them rather than they have to be passed around according to a number or according to a morbidity. And the second thing I'd like to say is that you've heard evidence today that gambling, the gambling bit is not the easy bit, it's quite difficult, but it's a tiny bit. And actually it's the rest of it. It's their housing, it's their benefits, it's their disruptive husband or partner, it's their debt, it's the poverty. So we've got to be really careful that when you're hearing evidence. So if we then talk about GPs, which is what I do, so if you want to get, and with respect to is there capacity, there is capacity. I mean, my services from standing start is rapidly becoming one of the major single providers of treatment services in the country, and we can scale up quite easily. But if you come to GPs, the three things GPs need, they need support, they need adequacy, in other words, they need to know what they're doing, and they need legitimacy. Is this something we should do? I don't think GPs per se, other than GPs like myself who sit in the middle, so we face the third sector and we face general practice, should be doing very much in this sector with respect to the gambling bit. I think there should be ways of them identifying people and the affected others, and I've already mentioned we've got ways of doing this now by implanting a question onto a digital triage, which I'm sure some of you use anyway. We've put in there a question alongside alcohol and drugs. Do you gamble? I haven't quite said it like that. Yeah. So that's the first thing. We've also working with some of the major providers of digital electronic systems. So if you come in and say you're a victim of domestic violence, your debt up will pop and the computer will explode and will say, have you thought of gambling? And then at a press of a button, you can get sent to our service, or you can self-refer. So I'm not suggesting at all that GPs do the management of gambling. I think they're far too busy doing everything else. But to be aware that their patient has an issue or their loved one, and to put them in the right space to get the help, I think is very important. We've already heard about the levy. The levy is really welcomed, and the more money is welcomed. But what we actually need to make sure is that we support those little charities that get right down into the swampy lowlands, the charities that are currently today working with Turkish refugees in North London, the charities that are working with my patients in Southwark, females in Southwark. So they're the best equipped, really, to work with these hard to reach, well, we don't call them hard to reach anymore, as well as the specialist sector, to do what I call the really tough, complex issues at the top.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for I didn't question
everybody
the word
uses
pathway,
the language, and I hate it because it's
right, because you're making us think about the people and the people who are impacted. So thank you for making that point. Henrietta, I think you wanted to come in online.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm speaking now in my national role as advisor on gambling harms. I think I'd like to share with you just briefly the national vision. It does encompass the training. Matthew's point is really, really important. The way we see it, in the future would be that all of us delivering treatment for gambling harms can be trained up together, and people will be really pleased to end up having their continuing professional development provided for free. Whatever organization they're working for, they will be able to have minimum standards of knowledge that are acknowledged, and then they'll be able to feel again that they're up to date and training, be they NHS, a voluntary sector, or primary care. To me, it really doesn't matter. The most important thing, as Claire was saying, is these are patients, they need our care. So let's make sure we're up to date with the best thing that can happen for them. So we are working on this. We've been working on this for a year to try and develop, and we are close to now thinking about what we can offer everybody. The second thing I think is a data collection. The reason why we welcome the levy, we welcome the extra funds so we can all work together, is that I believe, again, this is about people. Where are the people across the country? How many people are there in London? We're talking about London today. Who are the people, for example, in London suffering harms? So it's about identifying harm in the population, collecting the data from all treatment providers, the same type of data, so that we can speak to each other and understand where the targeted works needs to be done. And lastly, I think along the same lines, in my vision as a national advisor, is that the outcomes are collected in a uniform way across all providers. So literally what I'm saying is we're all going to be working far more closely together with the new levy ability to fund services and to then accommodate, hopefully, far more patients than we're dealing with at the moment, because if we don't end up seeing more people, we're not doing everything correctly. We know they're out there. That's me for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to the chair now.
Thank you. Assembly Bob, you can ask your question and carry on with the section. Yes, you're picking up from question 18 onwards, right to the end.
Thank you. There's been a lot of voices in support of a statutory levy. I think that's fair to say. Are there any dangers in a statutory levy?
Can I start, if that's all right?
Yes, please.
I think there is a danger. I really am pleased about the statutory levy. I think it should bring in more money. But I have some concerns that actually we may lose inadvertently, as we want to parcel everything up into a neat, tidy framework, that we might lose some of the flexibility and innovation that has actually grown from the system to date, such as, I mean, yesterday I was in a meeting with about 60 third sector providers, ranging from people that work in prisons to people that work in custody suites, right across the board. And I think if we're, and I'm pleased to hear what Henrietta said, I think there has to be the equivalent, and I'm old enough now to remember the National Treatment Agency for Drug and Alcohol. There has to be a multi-agency commissioning organisation, of which the NHS is part of that, in order to how to use this levy, because otherwise we may end up, dare I say, spending the money as we've always spent, building systems that we don't necessarily need. The world has moved on considerably. We've already heard that many of the women in particular like to engage online. Many people, in fact, something like 90% of our patients want to engage online. So buildings and funding on buildings, other than inpatient facilities, of course, may not be the future. And my concern is, the real concern, and I've expressed this many times, is that the levy may catalyse us in the wrong direction unless we start building, as Henrietta said, the equivalent of a national treatment agency, which is, I think, for drugs and alcohol, lasted for a decade and did some extraordinary good work.
Agree. Could I just come in very briefly and talk about the positive aspects of the levy in relation to independent research? And when I talk about research, I'm not just talking about, the neurobiology of addiction. I'm talking about what are the questions we want to understand. For example, how harmful is gambling advertising to the population? Or exactly how many young people are engaging with gambling activities when they should not, and what can we do about it? So, there are big questions that currently we don't have full answers to, because not enough research has been funded independently for us to embark on finding out those answers. And I do think policymaking, government does need answers that are provided by experts, but experts need to be given the time to find out what the answers are. So I think from that perspective, the levy is extremely welcome, not just from a treatment perspective. And of course, I welcome it personally, and in terms of my role, also on the prevention and education side, to remove any conflict of interest.
If you can, sorry, did somebody else want to? Yes, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in on that question as well. I guess I would completely agree with what both previous colleagues have said. I think it's incredibly positive that we have the levy. I think it wasn't a tenable situation to have all of our VCSE support commissioned, wholly funded by the gambling industry. I think we had to move on to a fairer kind of allocation of that significant wealth that industry generates towards tackling some of the harms. And I think what is going to be really key, as Claire mentioned, is working really collaboratively across all the relevant sectors. It cannot just be an NHS-led treatment offer. What we know from working in mental health services and in other services is it is those small grassroots organisations that are really critical in enabling people to access treatment where we are not providing a good enough service offer, or a service offer that is not reaching them, and that needs to happen in local spaces and with local grassroots organisations. So VCSE colleagues, as part of that wider treatment economy, are key, as is the intelligence and information from the research and the public health prevention support as well, all of which, if we get the balance right, can be significantly improved in terms of investment via the levy.
But how can we guarantee that those small organisations will continue? I mean, that's my worry about this statutory arrangement. And you're pretty much preaching to the choir when you talk about the importance of voluntary organisations, but we so often let them wither on the vine because we have big centralised plans for the things that the government runs.
And thank you, Mr. Buff. That's my anxiety, and my anxiety as well is, and I hope to be reassured, is that there probably aren't enough addiction psychiatrists in the country to man or woman every one of the proposed clinics that's being set up. So I think, if one reads into the future, that funding may well be subsumed into general addiction, so alcohol and drugs, of which gambling is alongside. So you could actually hypothesise that you may actually see less money available for gambling specific. And with respect to the NHS, I love the NHS to bits, but it is a clunky commissioning organisation, and I have been, not necessarily in gambling, but I run other services. I won't say victim because I love the NHS, but it's so clunky. You have to go through so many different systems, even that the commissioners change all the time, so you then have to start again, and it can take 18 months to get a decision about something. And when we've all had to rapidly change during the pandemic. We've had to rapidly change our service. We were going to go to every single practice. We had to rapidly shift that. We went to our commissioner, who was GambleAware, where we were able to engage. Now, I don't know whether we would have been a priority in our service if we'd been commissioned by the NHS. So I think you're probably right. I think there is a solution because there has been commissioning done that is fair. But I think it's not about the levy, but it's how the commissioning is done into the future. And maybe local authorities have to have a greater part in this going forward, and ICSs and ICBs, of course.
Yeah, Miss Christie.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add on that, I mean, I agree with Claire. I think that is always a risk. I think what NHSE are trying to do is establish a kind of good transition arrangements to the new model of commissioning that includes all the key people that need to be involved, so strong representation from VCSE, lived experience, and all the other kind of sectors, justice, Ministry of Defence, and of course the devolved nations as well will be part of that process. So I think the design of how that is going to work going forward is really critical to get right.
Those calling for a statutory levy often raise concerns about conflicts of interest with the current arrangements. What are those conflicts of interest?
Yeah, so at the moment, so I've got the kind of treatment spend figures. So at the moment, NHS England spends 6.8 million a year on the specialist network of clinics that Henrietta referenced. The figures we have suggest that GambleAware spends 15 million specifically on treatment and more on research and earlier intervention. That's all wholly funded by the gambling industry on a voluntary basis currently. So at the moment, the conflict of interest from our point of view, and which is why we kind of moved away from the joint funding arrangements that existed from 2019, start of the long-term plan, till 2022, moved away from a joint funding arrangement because we felt that was an irreconcilable conflict of interest where the industry that was generating the public health harm was able to engage and fund on a voluntary basis. The statutory levy enables an adequate sum, to be contributed across the whole sector, and we feel that that's a kind of more sustainable and morally justifiable position, really.
Can I just come in there? Because I am fully funded through the industry, through GambleAware. There are unbelievable governance arrangements, more so, I would say, than my NHS commission service, which I run a completely different space around mental health. There is no industry involvement. I've never met a member of the industry. They have no say whatsoever in how my service is run. And actually what I find odd is that the levy, the statutory levy, is still going to be the industry money. It's just going through a different route. So I don't know whether, GamCare, I think, probably might.
Yeah, Mr. Vice.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, I echo Dame Claire's view. The gambling industry has absolutely no influence, input, or authority over any of the work that the National Gambling Support Network delivers. The DCMS, DHSC, OHID, and the Gambling Commission all recognise that our funder, GambleAware, they recognise its integrity and its independence, and work closely with them and us. And it's just to emphasise, we would love to take, if there were health funding on a statutory basis for gambling treatment, we would be very welcome. We would welcome that. But the voluntary funding arrangement was determined by government, and there is no other source of funding that exists to deliver these services that we deliver on behalf of patients. And just to echo Dame Claire's point, again, there are multiple levels of governance within the system and oversight to ensure that there really is no influence at all.
Right. Mr. Hickey.
I could go on about our governance arrangements, but it's exactly the same as everybody else's. That's what running a good organisation is all about. That you do your due diligence and you have your necessary checks and measures in place when being in receipt of any funding, whether that be direct or indirect. As an organisation ourselves, we've grown from £1 million to nearly £7.5 million. All of that funding is coming either direct or indirect from the industry, indirect through GambleAware, who I have to say have improved dramatically in terms of their commissioning and their support and their quality assurance of how money is being spent. They themselves, I would still argue, are underfunded for really what the cost is, and that they could do with more money, and therefore the level of funding suggested as part of the statutory levy is more than welcomed, because more money is required in this sector, particularly if we look at the penetration in the marketplace of how many people we're treating versus how many people really need treatment. That's really where the organisations flow. We have a blended model of income. About 70% is through GambleAware, therefore directly coming through from the industry on the GambleAware side of things. About another 10% through housing benefit, and then the rest is topped up by our fundraising activities, which may well be through the industry or through other sources of fundraising, classically as any other charity would do so in any other sector.
So is it fair to say you don't see a conflict of interest?
I don't think any of us see any conflict of interest. From
do you think that the NHS is the best recipient of should there be a statutory levy? Do you think the NHS is the best recipient of that money, or should there perhaps be some other commissioning arrangement?
I believe that there has to be a national agency that is responsible for national commissioning across the board, across England, Scotland and Wales. Right. I believe that has to be someone who is well versed and experienced in commissioning services. I have concerns over the cost base of the NHS in delivering that, and the agility of the NHS in coming in to deliver that. That said, I totally support what Claire was saying around the need for like a national treatment agency or a national gambling treatment agency, which could well sit within the NHS in terms of ensuring good governance and robustness. That is what is required. Is that the NHS specifically? Is the big question.
Professor Bowden, I'm sorry if I've taken a while to call you. Going with my colleague says it's quite difficult to see that hand.
It's very difficult. I'm just grateful to you. I just wanted to say, because I could only give an hour of my time, I'm going to have to leave you. This is a very important topic, and I don't think we will solve it fully. But I think it seems to me we are all in agreement that a sort of united approach, governed at some level by a shared data, shared outcomes, shared training is what we need, without any wastage of funds. That's why the ring fence money is so important, at a much higher level that's been in existence. Therefore, a 60 million will, as you can see, it's significantly higher than what we've all been functioning on. And I would add that there is indeed the need to fund at those levels in order to provide speed of access, and to do the outreach work that, as many colleagues were saying, are done so well by smaller charities, but really need to be scaled up and also indeed expanded. So I just wanted to say, if you've got any more questions for me, maybe I could answer them now, or leave my NHS England colleague to also cover as I leave you.
I think what you might do is get a few emails from us requesting further information. But thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person.
Not at all.
Goodbye.
And thank you for spending the time with us. Professor Garada.
Again, I think we're starting at the wrong end. I think what we need to create is a national strategy for gambling. And then from the national strategy for gambling will fall out who's best placed jointly to commission that. My concern at the moment, from what I've seen, including the levy document that's out for consultation, is it's sort of almost decided that we're going to get 13 specialist clinics and then we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And I think that may well have been the case pre-pandemic. The world was in a very different place pre-pandemic, but I think now, if you're going to recommend, I think Henrietta said this at the start, is for the London Mayor maybe to pilot a joint commissioning or a joint strategy across the whole of London that includes the police, the transport, housing, the third sector. Yes, those of you lived experience, but I think you've got 42 charitable sector organisations currently, the NHS and others, to start developing a strategy, because the National Treatment Agency didn't start with the National Treatment Agency, it started with a drug strategy. And from there, we really got 10 to 15 years of very, very, very good work across prevention, treatment, support, research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think my final question, I think we've pretty much answered all my questions involved. What more should the Mayor do to ensure that there is a good access to treatment services in London for people suffering with gambling related harms? What additional things could the Mayor do? Mr. Vice.
Thank you. And I think we'd be in agreement, I'm sure, with our colleagues at GambleAware on this, but I think there's something around a whole council approach to tackling gambling harms, strengthening local needs assessments based on population data, strengthening the statement of principles to set out the approach to regulation of land-based gambling and expectations on land-based venues, so compliance and enforcement activities. And then there's probably something in here around marketing as well, and what the Mayor may be able to do to mitigate the exposure to marketing for particularly for our children and young people.
The Mayor gets, TfL rather, gets £600,000 a year, so we heard earlier, from the gambling industry and advertising. Do you think some of that could be used to promote your services?
You'll spend more than £600,000 a year on benefits. You'll probably spend 10 times that on what London is currently spending on people's benefits of the cost of that. Sorry to cut across, but having got the tube here and seen for the whole of my journey, which is 12 stops on whatever it is, the Jubilee line, advertising gambling to me, £600,000 is a drop in the ocean.
Actually, I thought it was, when they said 600,000,
I think that's far too
I
little.
thought that sounded quite low compared to the adverts that you see.
Well, I see them all. I can't believe how many I see. I think you should replace all of those adverts with, please come into treatment if you're struggling, this, that and the other. Adverts on the public transport.
Just to
that was
add
the question I was going to ask, and you've answered it already. Thank
you. Just to add on that point, I think oftentimes in the industry advertising there's a kind of unhelpful narrative around gamble responsibly, suggesting that there's just a small handful of at-risk people that I don't think is reflective of reality, and is potentially stigmatising and builds on that sense of shame and stigma of, well, if I've got a problem, I must be the only one, I can't come forward. I think that's a really problematic aspect of the adverts as well.
And that is so true. The Mayor was brave enough to give free school meals to children. He's been brave enough to extend the ULIS zone. I think to be brave enough to ban all adverts on London transport would make a phenomenal, and replace them, not enough to ban, replace them with how to seek help.
I'm halfway with you. I think I don't like banning things, but it is astonishing, is it not, that there is no advertising on the tube to help those, directing to help those people, apart from the bit
tiny bit that Emma's just said.
The tiny bit that that I think is a statutory requirement.
It is a statutory requirement, and
but it's about what the Mayor can do. And do you think it could be a good idea for him to start advertising those services to help people who've got a gambling addiction? Mr. Hickey, you were about to say something.
Yeah. firstly, you asked what the Mayor can do, and I would fully support what Claire said around London taking the initiative and developing its Greater London strategy for dealing with gambling and gambling-related harms. I think that could be and should be a real focus falling out of this, for it to then build into a national strategy. I fully support that, and I think that that is a great opportunity to London, to not just to be London leading England, Wales and Scotland, but leading the world in this. I think secondly, there is a massive issue around awareness that treatment exists, and therefore we have to do something to the general public and with the general public so that they are understanding that there is treatment out there for those dealing with their problem gambling, whether that be for the partner of the individual dealing with it to understand the signs and understand that they can help them. And I think there's a lot to do with that, and I think you have to do that in collaboration personally. You can't do that in isolation from the industry. You have to do that with the industry. And I know that sounds quite a dangerous thing when we talk about influence by the industry, but yes, we have to do that collaboratively. I think to do it without would be a real step backwards.
I think that's brilliant to end my questioning on, to basically say, to promote to Londoners and people who are suffering with gambling addiction, that there is help out there. It just needs you to take the first step.
And into custody suites.
And into custody suites as well.
As Liverpool are doing at the moment.
That's a very good point. Custody suites. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boff. I think you make a very important recommendation, which we will pick up. But I just want to explore one question, and this is probably the doctor bit in me, okay? Is if I see a patient who has a drug allergy, the first thing I do is stop the drug. Is it better to promote that help is available, or to stop the advertisement of the gambling in the first place? Which is better?
Well, I think that's a $64 million question. I think both, to be honest. If you see a patient in your clinic who is injecting drugs, you will direct them to a service, but you don't get adverts on the tube asking somebody to take heroin. And what we're doing at the moment, I think, as Emma's done, is we've made it so normal to gamble that we're pushing the at-risk population. So I think both you should do.
And I just add to that another of the opportunities that the levy presents is 15 to 30% of that levy funding will be focused on prevention and education, and it's great that the education piece has come into that. So there is a huge scope to do some upstream work in that space.
And just finishing on that and linking back to the strategy, what the strategy would also suggest is that over time, the more money should go into prevention and education, as the impact of prevention and education is reducing down the impact on treatment. So in 5 to 10 years' time, the impact that the education and the prevention pieces has will mean that less people are accessing treatment, therefore more can go into that, and it becomes a cyclical process in that. So that's why the strategy across all of the stakeholders is necessary.
I agree, and I think this could very well be a recommendation of the committee that we have a London-wide strategy. But look, thank you very much for making your time with the answers. There may be some questions which we may send to you. Equally, if you feel that we've overlooked something or you remember something later on, you can write to us, okay, and we're still open to receiving your contributions. So let me thank all of you for your contributions today. And can we note the report? You can go, but if you want to hang around for a couple of minutes while I finish off, we will do that. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Can we note the committee work programme and the additional activity undertaken since our last meeting? The site visit to St Mary's Hospital to investigate trauma-informed approaches to public health.
Noted, and
Sorry, Chair, could we formally thank Red Thread for that visit, because it was an excellent visit.
And I echo this formally on behalf of the committee. The date of the next meeting of the committee is on the 1st of February 2024 at 10 a.m. here in the Chamber of City Hall. I don't have any urgent business, and therefore I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.